There's a garden, what a garden, only happy faces.
Dr. Gerald Power interviews Professor David Reynolds for Megabooks.
Welcome, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be here with Professor David Reynolds to speak about his new book, Mirrors of Greatness, Churchill and the Leaders Who Shaped Him, which I've so enjoyed reading. I really cannot recommend it enough to you. I think what's impressive about the book, just to start off, is that it's just a rare achievement to get an original book out of Winston Churchill, who has been raked over and brought into the light and whatever, castigated, celebrated, recounted countless times. So it's a book on a familiar topic, which is original, and it's also just beautifully written. Absolutely beautiful. I read the conclusion first. I was just blown away by how elegant the prose is, and that doesn't come just from style, but from just the topic. It's at your command. So that came across really clearly. So I'm very much impressed by the book. I hope you all buy it and read it and enjoy it. I know you will. I think the first question I'd like to ask you is what the book tries to do.
Well, before I answer that, I would just say that it's clear to me that if I need a new agent, I know where to go. But thank you for your very kind words. Why did I write it? Well, in part, it was a lockdown project. And the great thing about Churchill is that much of the material has been digitized by the Churchill Archive in Cambridge. And then, for example, all the House of Commons speeches are available. So that was the starting point, but certainly not the end point. Because what was interesting was that in talking to my publishers in London, they certainly didn't want a book of essays. But what interested them about the idea was that looking at Churchill through the eyes of other people who dealt with him was an interesting angle. And also seeing through that interaction what were the kinds of concepts of leadership and greatness. So one of the biggest contrasts in the book is between Churchill and Gandhi, for example, the Indian leader, where Churchill, a graduate of Sandhurst Military Academy and all the rest of it, a soldier initially, someone who is always thinking about war, is encountering somebody who wields enormous power and influence, but does it, as I say in the book, through the power of powerlessness, that it's deliberately dressing down as an Indian peasant in a dhoti, a loincloth, commending what are thought to be womanly pursuits like spinning and so on, that he does not want, Gandhi does not want India to become an industrialized country. He believes it should cultivate the peasant values. Again, Churchill thinks that's denigration of civilization and progress. And so you've got a complete clash of people here. So that was part of what attracted my publisher, doing it in a different way through these people. And that was because I think in Britain, there's a feeling now, we've had an awful lot of Churchill. So what's the new tack on this? In America, it was very different. What interested them was just Churchill. They're still fascinated by Churchill, who is a relatively uncomplicated figure as far as Americans are concerned. He was the leader in the Second World War. He was the leader in the Cold War, Iron Curtain, all the rest of it. So figure to be celebrated. And so what they wanted was another biography, a different kind of biography. And so the lockdown book sort of moved gradually from being a set of different angles on Churchill to being a different way of telling his life. And I think it works reasonably well in that sense, that it takes you from the beginning, from his father, his relations with his father, right through to the later part of his life, the post-war premiership and things like that, and also ends with the person who I think is fundamental to his life, Clementine, his wife. The last chapters in the book are about people who probably would not be considered great by many conservatives in Britain, but who, it seems to me, give us a different perspective on greatness. Gandhi, I've mentioned Attlee, the British Prime Minister, who took the lead in decolonisation and, of course, believed fundamentally in socialism in a very basic nationalisation way, which had its strengths, but it had its weaknesses, but that was moving Britain on. And then his wife, who should be in the book because of her importance. But it was interesting, one of the more conservative reviewers complained about one thing. He said, why does there always have to be a book? Every book has to have a chapter on women in it now. I think, oh, well, but I think Clementine is in there in her own right. And part of what was fascinating writing it was actually to see, and we can come back to it if you want, just the way in which actually, although he was a complete male chauvinist pig, couldn't do anything for himself, in the end, the marriage was something that gave her life a completely different meaning. So it was a two-way kind of thing in the end. And that was interesting as well. Yeah. So that's a long answer to your question, but it started in one way and it became increasingly a way of telling his biography.
Yes.
And since he's now, as I say at the very beginning, he's 150 years young this year, 1874, 2024. Yes, this is an appropriate time to do it.
No, to be sure. Yeah, so a biography with a big difference, this book. Yeah, without doubt. Now, in the Czech Republic, I think we tend to set up an antithesis between Churchill and Chamberlain. So the appeaser and then Hitler, the demonic empire builder. Now, does that basic antithesis, does that hold up, having done the research and looked at Churchill in the context of his attitudes towards Chamberlain and Hitler?
Yes, Churchill was pretty clear in 1938 that Chamberlain was mistaken to run after Hitler in September 1938, those 3 visits to see Hitler. But what's interesting, and this partly grew out of a book I've written some years ago about summitry, is that in its time, Chamberlain's decision to go and see Hitler was just world-shatteringly significant. Yeah. Here is a man who's, I think, 69, something like that, has been in a plane once on a joyride around Birmingham Airport, is now flying 4 hours over the Alps and everything to see this man. He does it 3 times, and it appears that out of this possibility of war comes a chance of a settlement and the Munich Agreement. And the important point, I think, that's perhaps not appreciated in Czechoslovakia as it was in the Czech Republic now, is just because obviously from your point of view, this is a case of thinking, well, why were we sold down the river? Chamberlain was convinced that he was trying to stop a war. When we say a war, he wasn't thinking simply of a war in Central Europe. His assumption was that this war would begin by ferocious German bombing raids on London. His assumption was Hitler's main target was Britain, and that the bombing of London would bring tens of thousands of casualties in the first week or two. And a British Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan, in the 1960s, when he was writing his memoirs, he said, as I look back on 1938, we were thinking about the impact of bombing in the way we think of nuclear war today in the 60s. So when Chamberlain is saying, I'm trying to stop war, it's because he's thinking that London is going to be obliterated in a few months. Frankly, in those circumstances, if you're a political leader of Britain, what happens in Czechoslovakia is secondary. And that's what was going on, I think, in Munich. But you have to understand what was the scenario behind it. Now, Churchill is quite clear, and he's a military man. He believes you should call Hitler's bluff on this. He's pretty convinced that the Germans wouldn't be able to mount that level of attack, though he does believe that once air war starts, it could be pretty horrendous. But in any case, you shouldn't run after these kind of people. So he's willing to call Hitler's bluff. Chamberlain isn't. What's interesting later in the war, once the war gets going, is that when Churchill is in a relatively weak position after France has fallen in 1940, and when he's looking now for completely new allies, the United States, and then after June 1941, when Hitler invades Russia, he's looking for support from Russia. Here is Churchill, whose whole career has been about anti-Bolshevism and criticizing the Soviet Union. He's now got to try and work with Stalin. And he basically does what Chamberlain does. He flies to see Stalin, pretty epic trips in his time. He has a couple of meetings with Roosevelt and Stalin, but 2 with Stalin himself in Moscow. And essentially what he's saying is, I can do business with Stalin. I mean, it's a strange situation because they're not talking to each other as he and Roosevelt can. He's talking through an interpreter. The interpreter then translates into Russian. Stalin responds. The Russian interpreter translates. Oh no, the English interpreter translates into English. So you have this very convoluted thing. But both these men, Stalin and Churchill, they only look at each other. They're always looking for the body language, even if they can't connect it with the words. With Stalin, apparently, the striking thing was that this was a leader who was very different from Hitler. Hitler would walk up and down, he'd rant and he'd rage, and Mussolini looked like a kind of comic opera figure. You know, he's always dressed up in some fancy military uniform. Stalin, he doesn't look at you. He looks somewhere, you know, the side of your shoulder, and he's usually doodling, doesn't really look up. But eventually, when you get the translation, there's an answer to your question. You may not like the answer, but there's a sense we're having a conversation. And Churchill comes away from this first meeting in 1942, and it stays with him, convinced that Stalin is a relative moderate compared to the dark forces somewhere at the back in the Kremlin who are pulling strings. Now, that's nonsense. Sheila Fitzpatrick, who's written extensively on Stalin, you know, she says Stalin ran a team, absolutely. But everybody in the team knew who was boss. So this idea that Stalin is beholden to dark forces was Churchill's invention, but it was really potent. It helped him in a way to justify what he was doing, which was in complete contradiction to all that he said about Bolshevism and so on. So you have a sense of somebody here who's basically doing what Chamberlain did in a situation where there isn't much alternative, as they see it at the time, and making up the necessary story to go with it. And if you look at some of the things Churchill said, a critic of Chamberlain's appeasement, but not necessarily the word itself. Appeasement in its origin simply meant to pacify, to bring peace or whatever. And Churchill says appeasement from strength is, you know, he approves of appeasement from strength, from a position of strength. Appeasement from weakness, the Russians will just walk over you. So he's not completely against appeasement. It's how you do it. And for him, after the war, in the Cold War period, appeasement from strength means in close alliance with the United States. And that's where the strength will come, because Britain doesn't have that strength after 1945. So I find actually, and it comes out in the book, I think, I find some strange similarities between Chamberlain and Churchill in the context of their particular times. And the pre-war and post-war periods are so fundamentally different from Britain that this is, you know, the big change.
Yeah. I suppose that's an example of the little, or sometimes not so little, surprises that this book has for us, who think they understand Churchill and the contours of his thinking and his strategizing and his just approach as a politician. Yeah, I found the Mussolini chapter just riveting because he kind of sees him as a tragic hero. Is that
well, in a sort of way, yes. I mean, he's applauds Mussolini for standing up against Bolshevism in the immediate aftermath of the First World War, when, you know, remember, not only is there a revolution in Russia, but there's communist government for several months in Hungary. There's communist revolts in Munich, places like this. So it looks like communism is spreading. And Mussolini is the one who really stops it in Italy. And Churchill applauds that. Plus the fact Mussolini in his youth is a pretty mesmeric character. You know, he has a sort of commanding image. Churchill's wife says, you know, he has amazing blue eyes. And no, they're very taken with him in the 1920s. And Churchill hoped for a long time to hold him away from Hitler's embrace, because in so many ways he could see that it's not in Italy's interest to be so totally dominated by Germany just over the borders and so on. But when Mussolini throws in his lot with Hitler, at that point he's finished as far as Churchill's concerned. But there's always a feeling there about a certain personal tragedy, you know, a great man that had gone wrong. And there's sympathy for that in the memoirs as well. So
yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So we have to bring things to a close because we have a finite amount of time, and you've got a finite amount of time to be with us today. As a general last closing question, could I just ask what maybe surprised you most researching this topic?
Well, I suppose you could say continuing to surprise, because the instinct I've had for a number of years writing about Churchill is that in Britain he is, if you like, a two-dimensional icon. We stick on the wall. This is a man who's actually a really vivid, volatile character. He's, you know, robust bulldog image doesn't do justice for the vitality and versatility of the character. So what I want to do is try and convey that to people. And these explorations have accentuated that, because what I think is wrong indeed about Churchill, and I think about other leaders, is put them on a pedestal where they lose touch with their humanity. I mean, these are all, in the end, ordinary people, even if they're quite often extraordinary. And if we put leaders on pedestals, then we create intolerable pressures on them in a way. To see Churchill, warts and all, to see him as a human being is, I think, really one of the main things I'm trying to do in the book. And it's also what I say towards the end when we're thinking about Churchill's heritage and what he passes on. I don't think we have to accept his worldview. I mean, he didn't want the British Empire to fall apart or anything like that. But he says at one point, he says it quite a lot when he's fighting in North Africa and in Italy, and he's frustrated by the generals who don't get off the coast and get inland. He said, I expected this landing to be a springboard, not a sofa. A springboard, not a sofa. And what I think that's a useful clue for thinking about heritage in Britain, Churchill's heritage, but maybe in other countries as well. Just thinking and saying, okay, the past we're proud of is not something to sit back on and say, no, aren't we wonderful? We've always been wonderful. We always will be wonderful. God save the king, sort of thing. But to say it's a springboard. We jump on into the future with that sense that we've coped with crises in the past. Let's do it in the future. That seems to me something that properly understood Churchill's life can convey to us. And I think it's something that most countries that are proud of their past, whether it's Britain or Czech Republic or whatever, should also say about their past and their future.
That's a lovely, optimistic, springboardy way to end the discussion. Once again, my appreciation for the book, and we'll have to try maybe to mingle now in our bookshop for the
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, David. Thank you.